Elke vrijdag wordt in de ouverture een lezing gehouden die in het teken staat van Nieuw Babylon 3. Dat houdt in dat vanuit de inwoners, vanuit de betrokkenen, wordt er een visie gevormd over het toekomstbeeld van West Zeeuws-Vlaanderen. Hoe gaat onze streek eruit zien over 50 jaar? En daar heb ik ook jou bij nodig. Dus graag nodig ik je uit om iedere eerste vrijdag van de maand naar de ouverture te komen en ook daar je bijdrage te leveren aan onze toekomstvisie.
All our actions are interactions. An architect was asked to design a university campus on a piece of land that, if you look at it from above, it looks something like this. So she designed 3 departments and she built them on the site. However, contrary to the expectation of the staff and the students, she didn't put any routes or pathways to walk. Instead, she plants the whole site with grass. After the first semester, paths appear in the grass. The architect then comes back and paves these pathways just as they appeared. And she noticed 2 things. The first thing is these pathways were not in expected locations. She wouldn't have guessed. And none of them were straight. Now, I tell this story to highlight 3 ideas, 3 concepts. The first one has to do with the intelligence of users. Then it's the honesty of behavior, and the quality of time is the last one. An interaction is an action between 2 entities. An interaction is that relationship put into action, made alive, energized. An interaction is like a living relationship. Now, any interaction you can think of, any at all, always happens within a certain context, within a certain environment. So the context is only as important as the quality of the interactions. So when we talk about the honesty of behavior and the honesty of flows and how people move and the honesty there is in that, then we talk about actually moving from conversations to observation. And this is where we look at interactions not in the limitation of conversation and talking, but in all the different forms of interactions there is. Any role you can think of, whenever you're doing it, there is these 3 qualities. And this is the quality that we build into a system, not as a reactive, but as a proactive quality. This is where we prepare the system to adapt to the future before it's even faced with the challenges. Designing sustainably is facilitating the process even 150 years into the future. And that means that when we want to use this value that time gives us, we need to actually facilitate interactions along this 4th dimension, the time dimension. Ladies and gentlemen, even though these 3 concepts revolve around the notion of interactions, here is what I've learned. Do not design interactions. If you try, it falls back into the role of being a dictator, whether we like it or not. It's too easy. We cannot design interactions, we can facilitate interactions. And we facilitate interactions by designing the context in which interactions can emerge. Do not design interactions, instead design the context for interactions. As Jacques mentioned at the beginning, 2 years ago, we started this collaboration with the verkeersonderneming. And we started basically working on this program called the Deze. Many of you might be familiar with this program. The essence of the program is really to look at not necessarily the quality of the infrastructure itself, but how do we use it in the best way possible. It's not about the context, but about the flows on the context. And this is where the notion of people becomes very important. It's about looking at the behavior of people on the way. And it's not necessarily, as a lot of you may think, to basically get people out of the car. There is nothing wrong with the car if it's at the right time, at the right moments, in the right way. It's about simply looking at our mobility behavior. How do we travel? And actually, what suits different people? There is no one-size-fits-all in mobility. And what we realized very quickly, especially in a region like Rotterdam, is when we're talking about cities, we're talking about organized complexity. It's complex, but there is order in that chaos. And this principle is actually applicable to large cities, but also smaller cities and smaller villages and different areas like the area we are in here today. So the idea behind this is to look at not necessarily the infrastructure, but how we use it. We have enough experts looking at the infrastructure itself. we're still not using it in an optimum way. And this was really the trigger of the program, but specifically of actually my team on this program. We were concerned with the citizens of the city and how do we help them make better choices when it comes to mobility. This is one of my favorite quotes. Cities are the result of 1 million individual human action. 1 million human decisions. They're all rational, but they're not coordinated. They're independent. Which means that the result is an entire behavior as a whole that's quite unpredictable. Cities are the result of 1 million individual human decisions, all rational but not coordinated, which means the resulting entire behavior is quite unpredictable. And this is why it's organized complexity. A few studies have made, well, a lot of studies have been made on cities. This is a few I want to share with you here. There was research that showed that when a population in a city doubles, the performance of each of its inhabitants goes up by 15 to 20%. If the whole population doubles, each inhabitant of this city becomes 15 to 20% more productive. There's another study that comes from MIT that showed that an inhabitant of a city like London, for example, which has 8 million inhabitants, speaks on the phone with twice as many counterparts as an inhabitant of Cambridge, for example, which is 100,000 inhabitants. Interesting. That means that when a population increases in a city or in any area, the social interactions of each of its inhabitants is actually accelerating. Cities are the opposite. Cities are like stars. The larger the star, the more light they emit by mass unit. Not as a total, of course, because they are larger, but by mass unit. And that's also quite interesting. What that means is we're talking about an intensification of social relations, of social interactions. And this is not only in bigger cities, this is also in seasonal cities like the region we are here now, where you actually experience that yearly, every season. Intensification goes up and then it goes down, and then it goes up and then it goes down. And those are the waves we need to deal with. When we're talking about interactions, here is the question. Now, I said, do not design interactions, design the context for interactions instead. The question you might be asking is, well, that's great. How do we do that? How do we design contexts that actually can foster interactions? This is the question that drives me personally, and this is the question I've been exploring with the Vierkeurs onderneming as well, vis-à-vis mobility. And this basically comes from this philosophy I work with that I call architecting interactions. And this is based on the belief that interactions are the seeds of innovation. Interactions are the seeds of innovation, and this is why they're important. And we can't dictate them, we facilitate them instead. That's great, huh? That's all good. I heard that, I get reactions and people say, that's great, but how do you do it? What are actually the practical steps? And the practical steps are the following. My background from architecture, I know the architectural process. The architectural process is a very limited process. It does not lead to what I'm talking about. So basically, we had to come up with a different process, a custom design process. And it's an intrinsically collaborative process. It does not work if people don't collaborate. And it's based on what I call the communal creation of knowledge. I will explain. It's a 4-phased process. The first phase of the process is what we call appreciate. And this phase is basically based on gathering different insights from people. The first step is we look at the problematic and we look at who are the people involved in this problematic. And it's not about the client per se or the authority per se, it's about the end users first and foremost. And then around them all the different groups. And then we actually go into conversations with these groups because this is where we gain insights. This is the intelligence of users we're talking about. We go into conversations, we go into observations, and we collect all of these insights. And basically, with these insights, we create what we call an aligned understanding. Only then we can go in phase 2, where this understanding is what we can transform into a shared vision. Now we have this shared vision, which is the kern of everything that's going to follow. When we have the vision and it is shared, which is extremely important, then we go into the implementation phase, the kickstart phase. And this is where the main bulk of implementing an idea happens. In terms of architecture, we're talking design development, permits, demolition, construction, etc., etc. Now, at the end of this phase is where traditionally any project is done. You've thought about it, well, you already did more than most, then you thought about it, then you implement it, now you're done. The experts can leave, the architects can leave. If we're talking about a building, they're never to be seen again. And people move in, and there is never interactions between them. It always reminds me of a good criminal that never goes back to the scene of the crime. And basically, what we do is, this is now the most important phase. It's the fourth phase, it's called adapt, and this phase can only happen after people start using the service, the building, the new context, whatever we're talking about here. And in this phase, it's based on observing these flows that we've spoken about earlier, that we can actually refine what we're doing, that we can actually bring those last refinement and make sure that whatever context we are creating is a living context. That means it can evolve and adapt with its users, hopefully 150 years into the future. The belief behind all of this process is that the users are the experts in how they use a context. Many architects will not agree with me, but it doesn't matter. We really believe that the users are the experts, and this is why it all starts with gathering their insights and taking them through this process together. This is, for me, the only way to go into the future. We do not have the answers. And even when we have them, things change so quickly that the answer is not relevant anymore very quickly. The only thing we can have is an approach to asking the right questions and finding the answers that will work and then will not work anymore. And then we have to go back to an approach of finding the right answers to the right questions, and then that will change again. We are now in the fourth digital era, apparently. You probably are familiar with the first two, the internet era in the mid-90s and the social media age. Does anybody have an idea on the third one that we're almost now actually coming out of almost? What would the third digital era be? Collaborative economy age. This is what we call the collaborative age, the purpose economy, the collaborative economy age. And this is where we are now. And we're very quickly moving into the next digital era. Any ideas what that is?
Uber.
Very close, sir. Very close. Uber. No, beyond that. It's now being called the autonomous world. And this is where we talk about this concept of not owning but sharing, of using things as a service, not the things themselves, etc., etc. So when we're asking what is the mobility of the future, this is a very interesting progression to keep in mind. I want to share with you one of our latest projects that is still in progress. So it's a big experiment at the Verkeers Onderneming. Are you ready for this? Yes. So I spoke to you about people, about putting people first, starting from people, and this is obviously going to be more and more the situation as we go into the future. So at the Verkeers Onderneming, we started with a very, very simple idea. We started with the idea that happiness is a human right. Can I have a show of hands of who does not agree with this? Excellent. Nobody does not agree. So we agree. Happiness is a human right. It's not a privilege. Now, when we're busy with mobility, we very quickly see very, very many cases where there's a very serious problematic. And the problematic is that mobility is to some people a hindrance. It is standing in the way of a better life. It is standing in the way of a better life satisfaction, better life level, or what we might call happiness in the big sense of the word. I'm not talking about jumping around happiness. I am talking about life satisfaction type of happiness. When mobility is a hindering factor to some people, then it is our responsibility to do something about that. Then basically we're looking at, well, then how can mobility be at least part of the solution to a lot of these problems? This was the premise of this project. And this is where we started talking about a notion that we call mobility happiness, mobiliteitsgeluk. And the question was, what is that? Does that actually exist? Does it mean anything substantial? And what can we do with it? Basically, the way we define it very simply is mobiliteitsgeluk, or mobility happiness, if I don't pronounce it right in Dutch, is the contribution of mobility to people's happiness. We're not saying that people's happiness depends on mobility, but there is a role that is to be played by mobility. To a lot of people, that is now not happening, which means that that can be the key to a better life for them. I'll give you examples in a minute. So we started from this idea and we thought, okay, who are we talking about? For a few years in the verkeersonderneming, in my presence there, and for years before I even joined, we're talking about improving mobility. And then you quickly realize that we're talking about people that are already on the road. Less traffic, more convenience, less cost, more efficiency. This is all for people that are already on the road. We call them the kunnen groep. They can travel. What about the people that are completely invisible? Because they're not on the road, because for some reason or another they cannot be on the road. Either it's physical disability, or mental difficulties, or financial means, or lack of education, or difficulty with the language, or whatever it could be. Some people are not able to be on the road. They're not able to go somewhere. And that's the first barrier. So we decided to focus this notion, at least at the beginning, on the niet kunnen groep, the people that cannot travel for whatever reason. And now we're opening up this target of mobility questions. Then we're looking at the goals. The first goal is to understand mobiliteitsgeluk, because we're actually still investigating what is that and how do we conceive it and what do we do with it. And then to create awareness about it, to create awareness that actually for some people mobility is a real problem. It's a real obstacle. And then if we can have it, we can increase it. And that's the good news. That means we can measure the current situation, we can identify actions we can take to improve it, and then measure again and see, is that successful? And this is what a first experimental pilot would be. So mobility happiness is really a question of the contribution of mobility to people's big picture of happiness, and the question is, well, how do you measure something like that? Happiness? Measuring it? Mobility happiness? What are you talking about? So this is the question, and we didn't start from scratch. The idea is to formulate, which is what we've been busy with, a mobiliteitsgeluk index. Basically a tool to measure mobility happiness. Now the good news is there's a lot of research that has been done about measuring happiness, measuring life standard, measuring mobility issues, but never about measuring mobility happiness issues together. So what we did is we studied years of research before us, so not to start from scratch, and this is what we came up with. The methodology is the following. We have first identified 7 domains that come from the agreement between different studies on happiness. Those are the 7 domains that are internationally recognized as important in people's lives. Now, when I say happiness, you can also say life satisfaction, that's the same. And they are issues of living standards, health, personal development, freedom, community, ecology, and governance. And then we're looking at, well, how important are these to people based on different age groups? Under 12, 12 to 18, 18 to 67, and above 67. After these domains, we have them here, the 7 domains, we had to create indicators within each domain, measuring tools. And we have a number of them in each domain. I'll give you a quick example. The health one, for example, includes fitness, disability, physical health, mental health, and physical access to health. Can people actually reach hospitals when they need it? That's an important thing. So those are the indicators, and then after that, we have a few what we call screening questions. And this is basically when you ask people surveys like this, you need to be able to control for gender, age group, place of occupation, family situation, education level, etc., etc. So this is what those are. And then we go into the content questions. So we have the domains. For each domain, we have a number of indicators. Then we have a number of questions. And then we have a range for the answers. It's a little bit technical, but you'll see why that's important. And this is basically the idea here. This is the overall index. This is what it looks like overall. You have 7 domains, a number of indicators for each, a number of questions for each, and then the response range. So actually, when people are testing this, it's quite simple if you look at it from the end back. And that's, of course, the point, to keep it simple for people when taking it. this is kind of the overview, and the question is, well, what do you do with the results? What do they mean when they come back? And this is where you have to develop what's called sufficiency thresholds. So we have indicators, and we have to decide, based on people, how much is enough. How much is enough to be considered mobility happy or not mobility happy yet? Because then we have to see, well, what do we do with this? It's not just to have scores, it's to be able to take action and increase mobility happiness for people. So we have the indicators with a sufficiency threshold, and then we have the domain with an overall threshold to say, okay, now we can actually have a bit of a separation between people based on how they answer, and we can create a priority on which people to act first. And then we have the index. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to go into more details. But for now, I'm going to move on from this. Is that okay? Great. So the Mobility Happiness Index is to measure mobility happiness with the aim to increase it. Not just to have a number, and now we have a number, but actually to be able to act on that. And that's the goal. And this is all still now in pilot phase. So I will let you know how it turns out. Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, to wrap up, this vision I shared with you today is what I call architecting interaction. It comes from my background of architecture. Of course, you realize by now it is much larger than architecture. It's really about innovating through interactions. That's the angle of thought here. And this is important because every context you can think of can foster interactions. And by context, it could be a space, when we talk about offices, schools, train stations, but it could also be a field. It's not just architecture or infrastructure or mobility. It's education as well. It's finances. It's agriculture. It's any field you can think of. And all of these need to foster better interactions. Only, of course, we're talking about different interactions in different situations. And we're talking about interactions to varying degrees. It's not always full-on collaboration. It starts with very quiet and private interactions. And then imagine that scale going from very private and individual all the way to the collaborative and public and louder, and everything in between. Those are the 4 steps to be able to do that. Those are the 4 steps how we can create contexts that foster interactions. And this approach is what I believe will help us be able to plan for the future, which is not very far anymore, and when we're there, to plan for the future after that, and then after that, and after that. Now, of course, what you notice is that the last phase of adapting creates a renewed appreciation, a renewed understanding, a new, fresh understanding of this project, whatever that is, which means that actually it leads back to a new appreciation here, which means that the process is not a linear process, but a circular process. It's a circular process, and it has 3 qualities. I said that the process is intrinsically collaborative. The process, if people do not collaborate, does not work. So in itself, it's an incomplete process. And the process changes continuously because we gather new information, we gather new feedback from people, but also from reality, from the context, which means that at any moment in time, the process is in fact impermanent. Now, what is the last quality of the process? Yes, yes, it's imperfect. Because, of course, a big part of it still relies on human beings. And that is exactly what makes it imperfect. And that's okay. The main point to remember is the process leads to results, to contexts that are incomplete, impermanent, and imperfect. And the process itself is incomplete, impermanent, and imperfect. Remember, do not design interactions, design the contexts for interactions. It's the context for interactions that we can design. And that means that now we are actually all responsible to create these contexts that foster interactions. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.